With this edition of Unlimited Sports, I'm Harmon Johnson. Throughout this semester, College of Journalism and Mass Communication students have the opportunity to connect with professionals in the sports media industry. And joining me today is someone very familiar with the CoJMC. Tyler Maun is a 2007 graduate of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with a Bachelor of Journalism who has become the English voice and face associated with international baseball, especially the World Baseball Classic and the World Baseball Softball Confederation. He's also the radio and TV voice of the University of Denver ice hockey, men's and women's basketball teams, and radio voice of Denver lacrosse, along with other roles in the Mile High City. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today.
Harmon, it's good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So, when did you decide that broadcasting was going to be your niche? You hear that story from every broadcaster. What is it for you?
The joke I always make, which is probably more truth than it is joke, is I think once I figured out that I didn't have the physical ability to play a professional sport for a living, I just wanted to be around sports for a living. And yeah, I mean, I don't even have a memory of a time in my life when I didn't want to do this. It's basically been since I was, a little kid. My dad has a tape recorder of me calling games on Tecmo Super Bowl on the original Nintendo. So I guess I've been doing it for a while because that was a very antiquated sentence.
That's amazing. You always hear like, where did you get your start? What did you do? So it's always a fun, unique story for us broadcasters. Now, you spent a couple of seasons broadcasting minor league affiliated baseball, but then you headed overseas. What persuaded you to go to Australia to kind of help start that over there?
Yeah, I saw a little nugget, a little news bulletin piece in Baseball America that MLB was looking at launching a league in Australia, and it was just sort of the confluence of like all of my interests. When I was at UNL, I did a couple of backpacking trips in Europe with some friends in the summers between my sophomore and junior year, and then after I graduated. And just always been super into traveling. I had always wanted to try living abroad. And so I basically just ferreted my way in to this MLB connection. I figured out the MLB email format and got in touch with the guy who at that time was the vice president of MLB International, who put me in touch with people in Australia. And I got hired to help launch a league down there. Yeah, as the media director of the team in Sydney. And yeah, I think I started that process in probably February or March of 2010, and by October of 2010, I was living in Australia, and I was there for 5 months or so, and yeah, helped that league get off the ground, and it was incredible, and that has led to a ton of different random things in my career ever since.
Were you doing anything with the University of Denver at that time that then you had to kind of put on pause, or was that kind of your first thing after the affiliated bowl?
Yeah, so my work with DU went back to my first job out of college, which was back. I'm from Denver originally. I moved back home after graduating from UNL. I was here for about a year and a half, and I did do some pregame, postgame, intermission, halftime stuff for hockey and basketball. I was the producer for those broadcasts on the radio. Back in the studio, running the board, doing all that stuff. And then when I would come home over the off season, when I was in minor league baseball, I would fill in, whether it was with basketball or volleyball or soccer or whatever. Um, so at that time, I wasn't locked into doing a whole bunch of stuff with them every single off season. So yeah, I think I was just kind of like, all right, not going to be able to help you out this off season. I'm going to Australia, and then yeah, just kind of kept those connections alive and kept doing that stuff after I got back from the ABL time.
Pretty good reason to get out of Denver every once in a while, I would say. Uh, Talk a little bit about your college experience at UNL, a little bit of what you learned while you were there, and what maybe the biggest takeaway was when you were doing student broadcasts.
It was amazing for me at UNL. So I started my college days at Washington State in Pullman, another really, really good journalism school, but much smaller town. I was way further away from home, and I didn't really feel like I connected there until really the end of my freshman year. By that time, I had decided that I was going to transfer. So landed in Lincoln. My dad's from Lincoln originally, had family there, been a Husker fan since day one. And I noticed when I got into the J school there, everything felt so much more hands-on than anywhere I had been before. There was some of that stuff at Wazoo, but it wasn't to the same level at UNL where it really felt like, at least just from my perspective, it really felt like at UNL they encouraged so much more of an ownership of, coming in and getting your work done and being able to work on KRNU, being able to do stuff on the TV side, being able to do games and all that. And I love that. The thing that always stood out to me and still does to this day after graduating is I can't conceive, you hear about all these other schools and their renowned journalism programs and all of that outside of Nebraska. I really can't conceive of a better education for this field than what I got at the J School because of the fact that there was so much opportunity to do so much stuff. You didn't have to wait around until the second semester of your last year to get on the air, to do games, whatever it was. That was really huge for me to know that I would get the opportunity to, call games with 80,000 plus people at Memorial Stadium or be at Haymarket Park or be, back in those days, the Devaney Center for hoops. That stuff felt so big time. And that was cool because it really does sort of wet your whistle as to knowing, oh, I want to do this. I want to be on this level. I want to be around this type of energy. And that's always been my biggest takeaway is I feel like I was so well prepared by the pathway that I was given at the J school that I can't conceive of anywhere else feeling like it would have done a better job in leading me into my career field.
Just in case you aren't aware, we recently, this last week, went through 35 broadcasts in the span of about 6 days. Was that kind of a similar experience that you felt back then? The sports media major that we have now obviously wasn't around when you were there, but what was that a similar experience you would say?
No, I don't think it was for me. I do remember having some weeks where it was like, all right, I got a men's game tonight and a women's game on Wednesday and a football game on Saturday or whatever it is. But that was like my biggest week. Whereas it's amazing when I see J school students now posting like, all right, I got 6 games in the next 4 days. Like, man, you get into everything, which is awesome. And that's one thing too that I think UNL does so well is it creates these opportunities and these pathways where you have, as much as you want to try, as much as you want to experience, there is likely going to be the opportunity for you to get that. We didn't have quite as much of that stuff, but I think also some of that stuff was on me, just not being quite as locked into like, oh, I want to do every single sport I can as much as I can. I think especially being a transfer student, I was a little bit more hesitant to get involved with, like it seems like they've already got their people for this and that and this. And so I think a lot of that is on me. But the opportunities that I did get were just life-changing, in realizing like, oh, this is real. This is something that you actually can do, and that's very cool.
Is there anything that you learned when you were calling games at Haymarket Park that you still continue to take with you today?
I think the thing that was biggest for me to learn as a young broadcaster is to let moments breathe in games, and I learned a lot of that at UNL, and that's still a challenge. I mean, I've been in this career path. I started as a play-by-play guy in 2009, so it's been over 15 years, and there are still moments where you do have to kind of pull yourself back and let the moment live itself. Without you trampling all over it. But that, I remember that from those early broadcasts of, when you call a home run or, a touchdown or a big three in a big moment or whatever, you don't need to explain every single thing that just happened in that second. You can let the crowd play that out, and then people are still going to be with you on the other side. So that I do remember that from, those earliest days of I still to this day remember the moment that somebody really like the actual in the moment exercise. I was doing a game on local TV in Lincoln with Cole Stukenholtz, who's still around town, one of my favorite dudes. And Cole was doing play-by-play. We were doing a high school football game, and I was doing color. And whoever it was, let's say it was Lincoln East. They had gotten to the end of a long drive. They had finally scored. It had been like an 8-minute drive, whatever it was. And as they punched it in and Cole called the touchdown, I noted something that I had seen that finally felt like they had kind of broken through with the drive. And Cole just held his hand out. And when we got to a break, he was like, and something like that, just let that moment finish and then give your analysis, which is the same for a play-by-play guide. Like there is not going to be anything lost in letting that play out. And I think I was a sophomore, maybe a junior at that time. And from that point forward, that was like, oh, I need to implement that in everything. And those are really cool memories to still be able to carry forward. And Cole and I are still buddies today, which is awesome. And yeah, those are kind of neat things to be able to look back on and know, oh yeah, I learned something in that moment that I'm still using.
That's amazing. Let's get into your career with the World Baseball Classic and the World Baseball Softball Confederation a little bit. Where did that start, and what is, just for the people that maybe don't understand international baseball, what is that?
Yeah, it is kind of complicated, especially because the initialisms for them are basically identical. But so the World Baseball Softball Confederation is the baseball and softball equivalent of FIFA. It's the international governing body. So it's what oversees international competitions in baseball and softball, essentially under the umbrella of the International Olympic Committee. Every sport has one of those. FIBA for basketball, the IIHF for hockey, FIFA, obviously. And so that stuff came along as a connection through a connection that I had with the Australian League. I worked for the ABL that first season, which was 2010, 2011, and then moved back over to the US. I was still working as a play-by-play guy in minor league baseball and was still working for the Australian League remotely. I was running the league and team websites, was doing graphic design, I was writing, doing a lot of writing stuff for them. Um, video pieces, all that. And in 2015, I got an email from a guy who we had hired at the ABL who said we were contacted by their broadcast partner at the time was ESPN Australia New Zealand. He said we were contacted by ESPN Australia New Zealand in need of English language broadcasters for this big international tournament coming up. And this was like in October, and the tournament was starting in November. And essentially, they were launching what is now the flagship tournament of WBSC, which is called Premier 12. But something had fallen through with their broadcast arrangement, and they needed English language broadcasters. They were like, "Will you be interested in this?" And I said, "Absolutely." So, like 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Taiwan. Did my first international broadcasts there, which was wild. It was a very different feeling process from any other broadcast I had ever done. I think I only was there for 5 or 6 days. Came home, and then the next summer, I basically just emailed them out of the blue and I was like, "Hey, I did this for you last year. Do you have any more of those events? I'd love to do some more." And they said, "Yeah, we have this Women's World Cup next month in Korea. Would you be interested in that?" I said, "Absolutely." So I did the Women's Baseball World Cup, and then later that year did the U23 Baseball World Cup, and just sort of got locked in doing all of these different World Cup events. So yeah, I've done the U15, U18, U23, Premier 12, which is their top level competition, and then the Women's Baseball World Cup also, and some Olympic qualifiers and some other things in there. So fast forward to 2022, and I was in an entirely separate line of my career. I was working for MLB.com, which I still do. At that time, I was a writer on the minor league side for minor league baseball at MILB.com. And I met with the guy who currently runs MLB International, runs the World Baseball Classic, just to ask him about doing more international prospect coverage. I felt like we could benefit from that at MILB. And we got to talking about the World Baseball Classic, and we just really hit it off. And later that, this is probably February or March of 2022, I sent him an email and said, this is when the lockout was ending with Major League Baseball. I said, I heard the World Baseball Classic is coming back. Do you have any information on what the qualifiers would look like in the broadcast situation? He said, let me put you in touch with people. And a guy that he put me in touch with, who was in charge of the broadcast situation, is a guy that I used to correspond with when I worked with the Australian League. Very random. And so I ended up getting on in the qualifiers for that. Got, sort of promoted, I guess, to do the main tournament in 2023. I did the first round, did the qualifiers this year. We've got another classic coming up in 26. And so the World Baseball Classic is actually under the is sort of the governance. Major League Baseball runs and operates it, but the governance is still WBSC. It's still a sanctioned event by their standards. That's the top level international competition, and then Premier 12 is like a half step down from that. Yeah, and so went to Taiwan in 23 to do that one. Went back to Taiwan earlier this year to do a qualifier for the 26 edition. Um, yeah, I think I've done baseball in 14 or 15 different countries now, which is insane, but super cool. I mean, I cannot conceive of something cooler to have done with my life.
And that's just a small amount of the work you've done with them. Another kind of long-winded question, what does the process look like to get to those places and preparing to call those games? Obviously, you get so many different ranges of game notes that are given out to you and players that you might not know who they are, where they're from. Just what is that process?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it is, you have to be very locked in to make something out of these broadcasts a lot of times because so many of these federations are, small and they don't have a ton of funding, they don't have a ton of personnel. So we'll get game notes from, certain ones. USA Baseball obviously does great game notes. Japan, Korea, Chinese Taipei. They do some really stellar work. The Latin American countries are really helpful, but sometimes we'll get a really small baseball playing country. We had Guam in a U15 World Cup a couple of years ago. South Africa is a regular at World Cups coming out of that region. And you do have to get creative sometimes in figuring out stuff about players and teams and coaching staffs and all that. The most helpful stuff that I've ever encountered with all of those, especially at the younger levels, is just talking to people on the ground. When we get there, having manager meetings, talking with coaches, talking with players, you get so many storylines just from doing that. The neatest thing for me, though, is being able to see players now in the World Baseball Classic who I remember calling in the U15 World Cup. That's the absolute coolest thing to me. And having that base of knowledge of like, I recognize this name. I wonder if this guy played in U18s back in, 2017 in Thunder Bay, Ontario, or whatever it is. Being able to make those connections is really cool. But the prep is interesting. It is certainly far from just like, all right, I'll open up the two sets of game notes and maybe game notes from the league or the conference or whatever, and I'll have everything I need. It is a far more interesting hunt, I guess, than the standard.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your work domestically here. You've called the AAA National Championship. You've called stuff for various leagues, like the one I was in last year, the West Coast League, called the All-Star Game. Is that an easy transition to come back and be back in an audience that kind of understands this style of baseball versus going overseas?
Yeah, it's I would say it's it's way more quote unquote normal, to do those broadcasts. The thing that's so interesting about the international stuff, and I never get tired of this, but people don't really get how does the format work? How are these teams selected? If you win this World Cup, what does that mean? Like there's a ranking system. How does that feed into the ranking system? It's way more straightforward when it's just the AAA National Championship game, and it's a Marlins affiliate against an A's affiliate. People generally get that stuff. But yeah, the little quirks of the international stuff is really interesting to me. Calling all-star games is very challenging because everybody's going to get in for the most part. You got to figure out, I know there was a great play made in the West Coast League All-Star game this summer it was like the first or second pitch of the inning by a guy who was just put into right field. We hadn't noticed the defensive change yet. And so you call it, you give the credit to the last player who was in that position that you've got written down. And then you realize, oh, no, wait, now it's somebody new in that spot. So that stuff is a totally different challenge. But those are really fun as well. Yeah, I've gotten to do a lot of just like, sort of random one-off or short format things, which are really fun. And it's been a while in the baseball sense since I was just with a team straight through for an entire season, which was really fun. Also, I did 4 seasons of the minor leagues doing that. But yeah, it's all very different. To have learned it in so many different aspects has been really cool.
Let's talk just briefly about Home Run Derby X. I know we talked about this in the past, but what is that like? It's obviously completely different than regular baseball, and maybe how is that diversifying your portfolio while also helping grow a game to a different audience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The way I've sort of described Home Run Derby X to people who don't know what it is, which I think is the majority of people, it's very much a baseball adjacent thing in the way you think of banana ball or cosmic baseball or all of those types of things, where it's not strictly baseball, it's kind of a twist on baseball. Home Run Derby X is a 3-on-3 team-based home run derby where when you're hitting, there is a team in the outfield, the team that you're playing against. They can get points by catching anything you hit on the fly. You get points by hitting home runs, obviously. And it's cool. We go through 3 innings. We match up. Generally, an event will have 4 teams. We'll have a semifinal on each side and then a final. This year, we had a bracket format where all of the final winners moved on to a championship weekend that we had in Salt Lake City back in September. And it's really neat. And yeah, I'm the in-park play-by-play person for that, which is way different. You're ordinarily, I think you only think of in-park people as MCs, really, or sort of the promotions people, whatever it is. This is kind of a hybrid play-by-play slash MC job, and it's challenging. I mean, I'll be honest, I've done it 3 years now, and really just like kind of figuring out how you're supposed to do it on the fly has been the task. And it's really interesting. It's not the easiest thing I've ever done, but it's really fun and it's really rewarding, kind of trying to, chart that pathway with an event that is new that really nobody has ever done before. But yeah, tailoring that to a crowd in a ballpark rather than listening to you on the radio or watching you on TV, that's totally different. The mechanics and the pacing of it are totally different. Sometimes I have an analyst with me, sometimes I don't. That's different. So that's been really unique. It's been really cool. It was a very unforeseen thing in my career, but it's been cool.
I started off our talk talking about you going overseas, and I'm bringing it back here to kind of the college mentality. A lot of student broadcasters will get an internship one of the summers going out and calling summer collegiate baseball, minor league baseball, something, and coming back. But a lot of them find a new place that they're not used to. Is it important, kind of like what you did going to Australia as an early professional, to kind of go away from what you're used to help advance your career?
I think so. I very much think so. I started my career not doing that. I moved back to Denver and worked for a radio station here for a year and a half, and then realized, if I want to get to do the things that I really want to do in my career, I am going to have to leave. And so when I was 23, I got hired by a minor league team in South Carolina, and I spent 3 seasons there. One of those off seasons was when I was in Australia. And then I moved up to a AA team in Pennsylvania, and I lived there for a season. And I do feel like I learned so much more being outside of my comfort zone. In those 4 years, I crammed in 20 years of learning as a person of, how you handle sort of that personal adversity of being far away from home and having to learn how to, to navigate your adult life. It's one thing to navigate your college life. And be away from home and all that stuff, but doing it as an adult where you're reporting to a job and you're paying bills and you're doing all that stuff, I do think that was tremendously vital. And I would advise everybody who even has that as like an inkling, like, yeah, go chase it. Because when you're 40, if you look back and think I had that opportunity and I didn't do it, ask yourself if you're going to be okay with that. Because I know, I'm 40 now, and if I was sitting here thinking like I had a chance to go to Australia at 25 and I didn't do it, I would kick myself for that on a regular basis. And I'm really proud that I did do it, and it opened up a lot of different doors. It's not easy. Like making those jumps can be really difficult, especially if you've never really been away from home before. But I think that is, it's just such a compressed way to grow as a person. And I also think traveling and being around other people and learning, especially if you're fortunate enough to do it overseas, you just learn about the world and you learn about people. And I think you get to be a wildly better rounded person. The stuff that I've seen and learned and been around now compared to the person I was at 25. I'm just really proud to have gotten to have those experiences. And I think even if it's just a case where you grew up in Gretna, but you end up moving to, Port Angeles, Washington. It's just a different world. It's a different type of people. It's a different climate. It's a different environment. That stuff's it's really important. And you can always go back. If you go somewhere and you don't like it, home will be there. And that's sort of how I always approached it. And so I do think that it gave me a lot in terms of my growth as a broadcaster, but even more so as a person.
What's the next step, or is there a next step for you in your career? How do you kind of continue to find the joy in what you do, despite baseball being a very repetitive game?
Yeah, man, I just love it. I'm very lucky to just love it, every day to get to go in and do something that I would pay to do otherwise is a really cool feeling. It's interesting because for so long in my career, I just viewed these things as this linear progression of like, oh, I got my first minor league job at high A, and then I got a double A job, two steps away from a big league job. But then things change in life. And the situation I was in Pennsylvania wasn't a good one. And I moved home to Denver and, started doing stuff with DU more regularly and then was writing on the MLB side. And then, the DU work turned into work with Altitude, a regional TV network out here. And, that stuff leads to opening more doors. The writing work and the international work ended up, leading to that broadcasting stuff. And so I think over the last several years, I've realized like I don't really know if I can pick out what the next step is. I've just been lucky to be taking some cool steps and continuing to take those, I think is sort of the goal. The industry is in a super weird place right now. I don't really know what that means. I don't know what that means for me. I don't know what it means for anybody else. But you just keep, kind of throwing punches and trying to duck and hang in until you land a big one. And I've been fortunate enough to land some really cool stuff to this point, and you just kind of you keep throwing your chips down and hoping that it rolls for you in the right direction. And that's sort of where I am right now. It's the start of all my college stuff right now. I'm going to be doing a lot more with Air Force athletics this year. I'll be doing men's and women's basketball and hockey for them. Still doing the DU stuff. More international stuff coming. The next 2 years, 3 years really on the international scene are going to be extremely busy. World Baseball Classic and Premier 12 and Olympic qualifiers and the Olympics in LA in 28 and baseball will be back in. And so, yeah, just kind of trying to stay where your feet are in a cheesy coach speak sort of term, but just try to keep plugging and not look too far ahead.
The last thing I'll just kind of conclude with is what's your advice for those of us that were in your shoes where you were those days in college? What is your advice for the current broadcasting students?
I think the overarching piece of advice that I have for people is just treat people well. Just as you're coming up, you are going to be referred to as the talent, or you're going to be the person that people are like, oh, I don't want to bother that person or whatever. You're a student at UNL. You are probably a humble kid who is from roots that you're proud of. Be that person. You don't have to try to be, there are people in this industry and um, colleges, schools, programs in this industry that are very proud to tell you where they went to school and how much money they spent on their education and their alumni network and blah, blah, blah. Just treat people well. I think that has landed me way more work than talent alone. Because if you're talented and you're a jerk, people aren't going to want to work with you. If you are maybe a little bit lacking the same talent as that person, but you treat everybody else well, that goes a long, long way. That's number one. Number two, I would say, is just learn everything. Learn as much as you can. If you were to want to open a restaurant someday, you would want to know what it takes to be a server, to work on a line, to wash dishes, to manage a restaurant, to do all that type of stuff. And that would make you the best conceivable person to open that business. So when you're working in broadcasting, try to learn that stuff if you can. When I started, I was not on air at all. I was just a producer, and I would do updates during the morning show on a morning drive show that I worked on here in Denver. But I ran the board. I produced and cut commercials. I did voiceovers. I did public address announcements. All of those things that you learn so you know later on when you are doing something that you really like, if something goes wrong, you know what that board op is going through. You know what that producer is going through. You know what that audio person is going through. And it humbles you in a way that um, helps you pull on the same end of the rope as everybody else. And that's what you need for a great broadcast. Um, just because you're the play-by-play person or you're the sideline reporter or you're whatever does not make you more important than anybody else who is on that crew or who is creating that broadcast. Because without them, you're not on the air doing your thing anyway. And so keeping that in mind and just staying level-headed and humble enough to know that you're a member of the team and you are not the focus, you're not the story. I think that's the biggest thing. And I feel like UNL was so great at just culture-wise making me feel that, hey, we're all trying to put this thing together. Don't lose sight of that when you get into your career, because that's a really important piece to always hang on to, and to have that respect and that admiration and that loyalty for the people you work with is really big.
Great advice to live by. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me. As always, it's a pleasure to sit down and talk with you.
Armin, this is great as always, man. So good to see you and good to talk with you too. Thanks for having me.
This has been a chat with international baseball play-by-play man and UNL alum Tyler Maun for Unlimited Sports. I'm Harmon Johnson.